Okay. Well, welcome everybody. And today we're going to talk about attachment. And I am Carol, and I work out of the Orem office for Blomquist. And as you know, there's some few workshops that I try to keep going on subjects and parenting stuff, a little bit of parenting. We're going to go into a lot of adult relationships with attachment and how that affects your parenting and a lot of things here. So we will get to attachment definitions and why it's important and what the background is with attachment. And we're going to, hopefully know what your relationship is with attachment and what it really means to you and what you think it is and what, the attachment theory is a little bit and how it's connected. And then, of course, how do we heal our attachment if we need to? So hopefully we can get to all of that and references in the back. So attachment is something I'm trained in and I've always been interested in for many years. Before I was a therapist, I was a foster parent. And I learned, this is one of the books that I had back in the day, of course. One of my first attachment books, Becoming Attached. It's a very big, long, very thick book. And it seemed to be important as we went through the attachment understanding and the attachment theory with kiddos and how that affects me, how that affects you, how we parent because of our own attachment style. And it just became very interesting to me. Since then, being a therapist, and I am trained in EMDR attachment, which is a different type of attachment, EMDR training, but it's trauma-focused attachment. So very interesting. I love it to death. So your attachment styles shape and influence who we actually become as adults and how we parent. So 8 principles of attachment of parenting is a little, side note here. The keys to a satisfying relationship is actually understanding your attachment. I just wholeheartedly believe that, because your attachment, as we get into the theory a little bit about 0 to 3, what happens in your own attachment affects how we trust others. So attachment is trust. So it's all about trust. Preparing to be a parent, how we feed with love and respect, respond and with sensitivity, how we use nurturing touch, if you've heard of the 5 love languages, all those kind of things, how we strive to be a balanced person has to do with trust. So there's a lot going on there with attachment styles. And I'm curious to kind of know how much of you guys know what the different attachment styles are. If you've read about attachment, because it is basically your strong emotional and mental bond that you form in infancy, 0 to 3. The very standard attachment theory is 0 to 3, and especially to your caregiver. So your caregiver, such as your mother, if your caregiver is even adopted children and people that are cared for by other people. It doesn't have to be the mother, but just the caregiver. So it's how you attach to the caregiver. And attachment theory is about relationships between humans, of course. And the most important tenet is that young children need to develop a relationship with at least one primary caregiver for a normal social and emotional development. So the brain actually develops differently. I could go into RAD, I could go into all kinds of developmental stuff with brain, but this is very basic attachment. So we're not going to go too deep into it. There's tons and tons of studies. There's my favorite, there's a monkey one, and we have lots of theories, but we have research that shows how the brain changes when the child's needs are met and they form trust, the brain actually develops differently than if there's a relationship bond break, I call it. So a bond break is what happens in a very early on development stage of where there's a bond break. Someone gets removed from their life, divorce, death, a crisis, things that change, which is trauma. So if there's a trauma disruption in the development, this really messes up attachment, right? Doesn't mean it can't be healed, but it just messes it up. So, okay, any comments or anything that you ever want to, if you think of something and you have a question or a comment, just chat it and I'll look at them and I'll, interrupt what we're doing a little bit once in a while here if you want. And if you have a question or comment, just, you can turn on your, push your space bar if you want. So the basics, Dan Siegel talks a lot about this, so I quoted him at the bottom too. But the central figure in the birth of his school of research, the British psychologist John Bowlby, he challenged Freudian view, okay? So he came up with this, theory, the attachment theory and the attachment styles, and when he was influenced by his own study of mammals and their young. And so it was traced back to observing what happens when the youth, the young, the young mammal, right, attaches to their caregiver, of when fear happens, when primates like chimpanzees and gorillas run to protective adult, when there is a fight, flight, or freeze happening, right? So when they're not feeling safe, as he focused on the development and the survival patterns of these mammals and then humans, we're wired like primate cousins to form attachments because they can't survive without them. So that's what happened. So here's the survival mechanism, right? And we have to rely on people to keep us safe. And besides that, there's a whole bunch of other stuff about, of course, feeding, taking care of your needs. But here's primal when something's going to attack us or when we just need to be fed. So that's where it kind of started there. So very interesting, but we have lots of studies during all that time and before that really shows what happens to animals and to us when we have a fear response or when our needs aren't met in that survival pattern. So, okay. So the attachment styles here. If you are familiar with a little bit of this, so I'm just going to go over the basics of this. There's a secure attachment, okay? That's where I can trust. I can attune with my emotions. Attunement is, I can relate, I can attune, I can be present with my emotions, I can understand them, and I can see how things directly upset me or leads to a cooperative behavioral relationship with two people. You can be cooperative and flexible in a relationship. There's lots more to it besides that also. Make sure we keep everyone muted. And so if that's what happened when you were 0 to 3, mostly, then you can deal with disappointment and attachment, resentment, and things like that. But when that's disrupted, like I said, in a very early age, then we have attachment issues of anxious or avoidant. So my favorite is just, okay, here's anxious and avoidant and disorganized, and we're going to talk about that. But think about the main things here are avoidant or anxious, okay? So you have two attachment styles that you develop. Now, you can be in the middle, like I said, disorganized, where you're just both. and it can go back and forth. But here's just a little shot of avoidant, dismissive, downplays importance of relationships. You're avoidant. You're extremely self-reliant. All I want that one to say is that you're counter-dependent. Okay. So I talk about counter-dependence and codependence. Anxious attachment is codependency. Avoidant attachment is counter-dependency. Not where we need to be. So you learn how to be counter-dependent, and you're not you're counter-dependent. It's not normal. You know, we're always, oh, self-reliant, be dependent on yourself and your own happiness. That's not human. Don't know what other planet that's from, but that's a myth. That's not natural. And it's not what we thrive for. It's not natural. It's not interdependent. So we want to be interdependent, but codependency, counterdependency, is not healthy. So it's two extremes. And the point is they're extreme, right? We don't want to be extreme. We want to be in the middle. So extremely, it says on 2 here, unavoidant dismissive is extremely self-reliant. All I want you to know there is extremely counter-dependent. And that causes a whole other issue. And there's a whole other book on just that. So 3, can become more vulnerable when there is a big crisis. So, okay, so you're more vulnerable. So you're going to be, and vulnerable is okay, but more vulnerable meaning you're more susceptible to other issues and triggers. So avoidant fearful is you're more dependent in relationships than an avoidant, and your strongly fears rejection. You don't like rejection. It's almost like an anxious a little bit, but you're just a fearful avoidant, and you have high anxiety, you know, so it sounds, so that's why I don't really go into the 2. It's just avoidant dismissive. And then really the avoidant fearful is basically high anxiety and anxious attachment. So you just have anxious attachment. So you can go into any of these at any time, but that's just a little bit of the basics, right? So of course, Bowlby believed that the earliest bonds formed by children with their caregivers had a tremendous impact throughout their whole entire life. And it shows. There's just tons, like I said, tons of research on this. It definitely has an impact.
Set up for the first and second in the hierarchy.
Let me mute you.
Can we
come in here? So if, you know, he suggested, it's like, we need to understand, right, what our attachment styles are. We really need to understand them so we can have healthy relationships later. So of course, that's what we're going to talk about as adults, because we can only go forward, right? We really can. So here's the avoidant, anxious, and disorganized. Okay. So as children, we may avoid parents, does not speak much, contact, you know, the avoidant. As adults, this is just an example. If we have little interest in emotions and social or romantic relationships, so avoidant again, unwilling to share feelings or thoughts with others. Not all the time, but if you are stuck in an avoidant attachment, you're going to be counter-dependent. I don't need people. I don't need this. I don't need this. I don't need to share. I don't need to be vulnerable. I don't need to, right? All those kind of things. And that causes a disconnect with relationships. And so you become more disconnected. And we are seeing that more and more, right? Anxious or avoidant attachments. For example, technologies and families. I did a workshop on that. It's on YouTube, and it talks about being together and apart, but being alone, but being together. So we're home together as a family more than ever. We're actually eating dinner a little bit more together than normal, even before COVID. And what's happened though is we're together alone. So we're together in the house, right? But we are alone. So we are disconnected than ever, but we're home. So anybody having that happen to you in your family? So meaning we are on devices, technology, but we're alone. So we're on other social medias, but we're connecting with people, but we're alone. So not the ideal attachment style. So here's some more examples of what avoidant, anxious, and disorganized looks like. Okay, so basically, this is just an example. So disorganized is like, oh, don't go away, but don't get too close. Okay, so you're just like back and forth. Sounds like a little bit of a personality trait that's not so healthy. So I'm going to push and pull and push and pull and push and pull. That's what that's called, right? And that's the reaction. In an anxious one, your needs are not going to be met by the other person. So I must try harder. So you get anxious and you chase the avoider. So if you're a chaser, then you're going to chase the avoider, and the avoider is going to get more avoidant and just more and more and more distance as the other person chases them. Because the scarcity in an anxious attachment is, I want approval, I want approval, I want approval, and I'm not getting it. And then the avoidant reaction is, for example, others reject my emotions and needs, so I shouldn't try. I shouldn't even trust them. And I should keep my emotions to myself and rely only on myself. Once again, counter-dependent. So not so healthy either. You think, well, that's about every teenager right now, right? An avoidant. I'm just going to rely on myself. I don't need anybody. I don't want to trust anybody. So there's some, kiddos out there like that go through that. Any questions so far? Where we're at here? And this, so just when you get the PowerPoint or you want to go through some of these, you can look at this, especially if you can't see my PowerPoint, if you're doing something else and you sort of follow along with the PowerPoint's difficult. Okay, so emotionally, how do we connect and how we pay attention and how we respond to our needs? So this is where we can go into children, okay? I suspect that most of you, maybe a couple of you have like a 0 to 3 kiddo, but most of us are out of that, I bet. You might be just not in a 0 to 3. So of course we can back up and say, how do we fulfill our child's needs 0 to 3? And is it over after 0 to 3? Like, do we have any kind of way to replace, what we've done, what we couldn't do? So for example, my kiddo had very bad colic. So she was just a very sick baby and did not have a very good first 3 months, and then for the first 2 years. So when she's crying and crying and crying, and I can't fulfill her need, right? Is that going to disrupt her attachment? Absolutely. And it's like, I didn't do anything wrong, right? You try to soothe the child, you try to, but if you do soothe the child and it does get better and you gradually get through where she can or he can trust you in getting their needs met, right? Getting fed, getting picked up when they cry, when they're hurt, you go and care for them. So those are all those things. And that's what this is about. That's what this book is about, by the way, becoming attached. And I'm going to make sure I have this even referenced in the back. And so before I send this out, so this is becoming attached by Karen, his last name's Karen, Robert Karen, PhD. So this is a huge how to become attached and how to help your first relationships shape your capacity to love. So super important. The other part is once again, Dan Siegel. I have many books by him, one of my top 5 authors. So in Mindsight, he talks about the child security of attachment and is not what happens to his parents as children, but rather how his parents made sense of those childhood experiences. Okay, so let me start over with that. It's how you make sense of, childhood experiences that what leads us into a secure attachment in adulthood. So, that's a little bit of work. So you think of your own childhood and you think of, where was there a disconnect? Where did I have a bond break? Where did I have a trauma? Where did I sought approval from a certain caregiver and I didn't really feel emotionally connected? I felt more emotionally neglected instead. And that's a book called Running on Empty, Emotional Neglect. So if you end up having emotional neglect in your childhood, your developmental stages, which is really 0 to 26. 26 is when the brain stops developing. So anytime during that time, if you have emotional neglect, it does make a difference on your attachment style, even all the way through. So trauma, we know, changes the brain. It can, mess up our trust, bonding and loving and what we think life is supposed to be like. So a secure attachment, again, is an example of this. When the mother leaves, the baby cries. Okay. When the mother returns, the baby greets the mother and is happy to see them. That's a secure attachment. So when my kiddo, or someone's, when your child, think about when they ran away from you in the grocery store and they never looked back. That's not a distressed child. They're supposed to have distress. Now, maybe, since this is going to be recording on YouTube and, forever, but who knows? But, I have an example. I've told this story, but it's like, so do you let your child have some distress when they run off? Do you let the, of course we don't let our kids run off in the road. It's like, hey, you have to stay by me. That's the point, is you teach them there is a way, they are dependent on the caregiver to keep them safe. The minute they don't feel safe is when you need to recognize and teach the child that. It's like, yeah, that's why you stay by me. If you get lost, it's going to be really scary and they're going to remember that. But if they never feel like it's scary to be lost, we're in an insecure attachment. So it's a good thing when a child feels distressed when mother leaves or caregiver leaves away from them. So an avoidant does not seek mother when she returns, or they focus on their environment. And another example, of course, is resistant, which is an anxious, very upset at departure. So anxious attachment is also this separation anxiety that we talk about a little bit. It's like, whoa. So when people come in with a kiddo that has a separation anxiety and they can't leave the room, right, without having a really big upset, and the child's really, really upset and it's past normal development, 9 months to 18 months, that's really normal, once again, for a child to be distressed when mother leaves the room or leaves them at daycare or leaves them with somebody. And that's actually healthy. So when the point is like, okay, then we have to teach self-soothing. But then when the child is okay and can self-soothe and calm their nervous system, and then someone else is helping them do that, then when the mother returns or the caregiver returns, father, caregiver, grandma, whoever's the caregiver that they're attached to, they actually get that reassurance, and they can trust that they'll come back. You can imagine my foster kids having quite a bit of attachment issues. Now, if anybody wants to chime in on that, why do you think some foster kids had an attachment disorder. Lots of RAD, reactive attachment disorder. Anybody have a clue on how that works? And I'm going to read this chat a little bit while we're thinking about that. Yeah, I think so. Interesting. In the development, healthy attachments to family members and must develop these relationships. And I must develop these relationships with guidance. Yes. So it is something that is very important. So to answer the question about why do you think foster kids have a lot of RAD, a lot of reactive attachment disorder, is because they haven't had a secure attachment. And there's usually neglect or abuse, of course, if they go into the state system, of what's happened there. So, okay, so how do we become attached as adults and have trust and have comfortable in relationships, seek support from partners? We have a greater sense of autonomy and I'm secure, but we still have dependence, right? Let's see. Okay. Let me pull people in sometimes here as they get kicked out or back into the Zoom call. So, okay. So let's talk about a little bit moving forward here about our own attachment. Why is it important for us to understand back at the beginning of this of our own attachment styles so we can be better parents and better adults and so we can be, you know, if we have attachment style issues, I think we definitely don't attach to our children as much as we could. So it's definitely a problem. So if you are an anxious, preoccupied child, you're going to be an anxious, preoccupied adult, and then you're going to be an anxious, preoccupied parent, or tend to be over involved in your children's lives. So what do you think that means? Like, so write down some things that you're overreacting in or you're over involved. So that sounds good, but an anxious parent is usually a rescuer. They're friends with their child more than they are parents, and they don't stay in the parent-child role. And if you want to have a whole workshop on that, it's one of my favorite models is parent-child-adult roles and ego and that triangle, and has stay in your own roles. If you are going into the child role, then you have an attachment issue. When you're a parent, you're not supposed to go into the child role. You're supposed to stay in the parental role. And you're supposed to be in a parent-child with your child, not with your spouse. So about 95% of my couples, and I do tons of couples and blended families and rebuilding attachment styles, is because they're in a parent-child role, they get really messed up in their attachment styles. So think about a teenager. You ask them where they're going, what they're doing, and if they're drinking at the party, and did you pay, did you make it to work on time? And that's what you ask a teenager. If we're doing that as a couple, as a partnership, we're in a parent-child role. If we're looking at our couple, say a couple is having distress and we don't trust them, and we're having to follow every little move they're making, or looking at their phone, or finding out where their location is, we're in a parent-child relationship. Super dysfunctional and super toxic. So that's a little bit of plug there for a totally different subject, but at the same time has very much to do with this early attachment style. And you probably want to know, maybe you can think about why would I be an anxious attachment? Nothing really happened to me in my childhood. I did pretty good. My parents were this, and I attached, and and I didn't have any traumas that were, early on big. you would be surprised. There's some subconscious stuff that we hold that we don't really realize that happened to us or didn't, between 0 and 3. It's all in your subconscious. And those things are held in the body. So sometimes they can come out later for sure. So any questions on that one? Let's see, anything else on this? So if a child is distressed, the adult tends to be self-critical, and the parent worries a lot about their caregiving performance, and that one gets into mommy guilt and parent guilt of like, so I'm self-critical, seeking validation from others, and then I have lots of guilt as a parent. So those are the 3 steps to that one for an example. Okay, so talk about trauma. We're going to talk about base root issues. Okay, I'm a visual. We got to, use a tree. I always use something that you can visualize. So here's a trunk. So we're going to talk about the real issue here about right here. Okay, so we're going to get to this root issue. So go back to trauma. So if something happens traumatically, so right here, development. So I have a workshop just on trauma. It's called Trauma 101. Okay. So if you want to go look up trauma and figuring out really what some traumas that you've had, because one, remember back at the beginning of this, you have to recognize what you're doing, what it is that and understand it, so you can be a better attached parent. So developmental trauma. So right here is just this one little part of this. What we're talking about today is attachment, bond break, fear, abandonment, strict upbringing, inherited family environment. So your environment, inherited family, okay, that does not say genes. That says inherited family, meaning what's happened in your family in your environment. Okay, because like I said, we don't come out of the womb anxious. We just don't. We have things that change our brain that make us anxious, for example, in the environment. So, you can have a very traumatic birth, and that can actually, with EMDR attachment, that's what we do a lot of early on trauma, from womb to birth. So yes, but yes, meaning it's not just genetics, it's not a gene, it's environment. Okay, so there's other types of traumas here, but this is all we're talking about today is this attachment bond break. A bond break is what I mean by that bond that you had with someone and it got broken. So like I said, a tragic, an illness, a death, a divorce, those kind of things. Okay, so developmental trauma, let's go into that a little bit so we understand it a little bit. One or more forms of developmentally adverse interpersonal trauma. That is pretty deep. One or more forms of developmentally. Now I said, remember, developmentally is all the way to 26 till your brain stops developing. That's a long time. So here's some examples of that. Emotional abuse, witnessing violence. So huge on this, okay? You may not know it, but a lot of people have, domestic violence in their early years and they were asleep. We know with domestic violence, even if the child is asleep in the other room, it affects their brain just even one time. So there's lots of domestic violence that happens with abusive families. And so witnessing violence and death, of course, betrayal, fear, resentment, defeat and shame. Those are all some of those developmental traumas that happen because of betrayal and abandonment and abuse. So PTSD, it does not capture the developmental effects of childhood. That's why we do not have, this is why there's a disconnect in the DSM. We have the only trauma diagnosis is PTSD. We have 0 developmental trauma in the DSM. if you know what the DSM is. So Diagnostic Behavioral Manual, our Bible, so it's like our Bible for diagnosing as clinicians. As I am a clinical mental health counselor and a certified family life educator, among other certifications. I have about 5 that are major in the mental health part and integrated medicine certification. So here's the diagnosis of PTSD. There's no developmental childhood trauma diagnosis. That missed the DSM this last time, like by this much. The Body Keeps the Scorebook talks about that and how we really need something to go off of like just developmental. But anyways, single most important public health challenge in the United States each year is 3 million children reported to authorities for abuse and neglect. So developmental trauma, once again. And does it manifest into anxiety? And so we call it an anxiety disorder? Sure. Does it manifest into RAD, into an attachment disorder? Yeah. But really it's from trauma. So we need to understand what trauma really is doing on the brain and how it begins at home. And 80% of the children that are maltreated, the maltreatment is done by the parents. So that's a little bit of trauma 101 on there too. But so treatment for trauma in this situation. So once again, if early, so trauma, of course, causes a disconnected trust, right? So here's how we help an attachment connected to trauma, which it always is. And so these are just some ideas about, okay, trauma-focused psychotherapy is CBT, cognitive behavioral, but then there's trauma-focused CBT. And EMDR, which I mentioned earlier that I am fully trained in, and I'm trained in the specialty of attachment EMDR. So you can look up that and figure that out. If this is something that will help you heal the symptoms of your attachment. I don't tell people and I don't promise my clients anything, but I promise you this is where it's at. This is how you get through the disturbing experiences of your childhood and desensitizing it. And that's through EMDR. Okay. And let's see. So I mentioned running on empty. This is just a slide on that, by the way. Emotional neglect has a lot to do with your attachment styles. And I talked about counterdependence. So this is just a quote from Webb on Running on Empty, Overcoming Your Childhood Emotional Neglect. I love the book. It's basic. In the beginning, it talks about 12 different styles of your parenting styles that you had from your parents, and what you will probably end up doing as a parent because of the way your parents did it. So the end of the book, and then there's a part for therapists, but the end of the book is very basic on how to heal and self-soothe your counterparts of parts of your childhood that was neglected. And I actually have a whole webinar just basically on this that I just did, I think it was last month or so. So look on YouTube for those. If you don't know what I'm talking about, we have a YouTube channel that these workshops go on and you can watch them whenever you want. And there's probably 40 or 50 parenting workshops, and we've got probably about 50 more of the other ones. So we've got about 100 workshops on there now. Okay. So let's manage the root. So a few things in the root issue. So when you can all, if we were all together in a room, we'd get a piece of paper and we draw a tree. And I've done this hundreds of times in hundreds of groups that I've taught over years and years. So I do this little exercise of here's a tree. The leafy issue is just a surfacey issue, right? It's just, the leaves fall off and regrow, but they do feed the root. Okay, there's your analogy. So failed relationships, financial issues, junk values, and addiction and thinking errors and all those things that are in the leafy issues, whatever that looks like for you, they can change. they can stop those issues completely. We can stop addiction. We can move through that. We can stop our thinking errors. 100%. We can get rid of our junk values and feed our treasured values. We can have a real relationship after failed relationships. Takes a little bit of work. It takes two people. So our trunk is our emotions. So our raw and our stuck and our betrayed and our hopeless, for example. And then our root issue is loss, grief, trauma, for example, some developmental relational trauma, right? Some self-concept, abandonment, attachment, shame, denial, mental health issues. There's supposed to be an N in there, mental health, chronic health stuff, okay? So if we have a chronic issue that's in the root issue and it's not going anywhere, okay. But can we heal root issues? Can we have a growth mindset on our chronic health problems or our mental health issues? Absolutely. That's a growth mindset into a different way of looking at it. It's called radical acceptance also. So we look at the root issue, and what is it? The root issue is what we need to treat. Okay, this is what we treat. I can treat your failed relationships, but there's a deeper rooted issue of attachment. I'm not going to get to your failed relationships. So I'm a little bit of a root issue therapist for sure, because it's like, get to it, right? So a little bit of reality and a realist there. So here's our self-concept. That means how we think people view us. So it's quite interesting. It gets deeper. If we've got an abandonment issue in our developmental stage of our childhood, or something's happened there, we can get to that, especially in our attachment bonds. So that's a little, you can just put one thing in the leafy issue, you draw a tree, put something in the leafy issue, like you say you're looking for a job, so you have the leafy issue is that you need to find a job, and your trunk issue is all these emotions that are happening. But what is in your root, and why you want to have a better treasured values in your root, so you can find the job that you want that's connected to your treasured values, not your junk values. So that's an example. I don't know what other examples go with that, but that's how you kind of just, and you can do that every day. You can just like, this is my issue, but really what's going on. And then you kind of figure out what your emotions are. It's always good to be aware of those for sure and be emotionally intelligent. So how do we heal it? Let's connect with this. So some tools, right? How do we become secure? Okay. There's several books. So I'm a book person. My personal website is paperbackconnections.com, paperbackconnections with an S.com, because it's a paperback connection. So how do we connect books with what we're healing and what we're moving through, and it's self-help, of course. So it's like, how do we find our wounds? Okay, first we talked about that. We have to find our wounds, right? Find out what wounded you. And we have to go past in order to go forward. So getting past your past is a book. We have to find our wounds to go through the past to get to the future. It really, because of how the brain and the body holds trauma, okay? Our whole being is about the past and how we respond to things. So if we got bit by a dog when we were 5, we may have a problem with dogs, later on, right? So that's because our body stored our fight or flight or freeze and says, oh, that was scary, that wasn't fun, the dog bit you, so you better watch out next time. It keeps us alive. So those are your triggers. So notice where your triggers are. For example, trust. Do you just trust every dog, that you come across for forever? No, you don't. You approach it differently. You have caution. You don't just go up to every dog, or you don't let every dog just chase you down. Right? You run. So you fight, you run away, you flee, whatever it is that you do with your fight or flight to keep you alive. So you find your wounds, we hold, so people that aren't boundary given people are not going to have a secure attachment. So that I could spend a whole day on, is just boundaries. So in order to have a secure attachment, we have to have boundaries. We have to know what those are. We can't be passive. So which is an avoidant, right? Counter-dependent, an anxious, a codependent. An anxious, codependent, or a counter-dependent, they don't have boundaries as much, right? You think, oh, I'm putting up boundaries. I don't need anyone. I'm being counter-dependent. That's not a healthy boundary. It's just avoidance. So we have lots of avoidant behaviors, meaning we have 5 things in America that we're really good at, okay? And we don't hold our boundaries on them to ourselves. And that's eating it, smoking it, drinking it, watching it, buying it, okay? We have lots of avoidant behaviors. And I'm in general in America, because we have worse statistics than any other country with those 5 things. So we're not holding our boundaries, we're just avoiding them. So the other parts, journaling, mind dumping, any kind of writing. So meaning, what is it that I feel about this attachment with this person, or my own attachment styles, or my childhood, connecting those, okay? Now body work, that's a big, basic, kind of open-ended body work. What does that mean? That could mean a lot of things. That could mean massage, that can mean energy work, that can mean yoga, that can mean, just sweating, that can be breathing, that can be just body, because everything's held in the body, in our neurons, our nerves, our body. Trauma is held in there, which is part of the attachment. Therapy, trauma release. Trauma release, very vague again. That's EMDR, that's T, trauma, CBT, exposure therapy, a lot of imagery work. So trauma really, a lot of imagery work. We use a lot of imagery work and all those kind of things. I teach the anxiety program for Blomquist. It's an ongoing program. It's free, just like these workshops. It's not recorded. It's a program. So you join, join the program. It's a 5-week program. So we do a lot of steps to exposure therapy, which can help with trauma release. So, okay. Anything else here for a minute? And I'm going to go over these books. Anything else in the chat while we're taking a minute to go over this stuff? I'm just reading the chat here. I've not worked with, someone's asked like if I've worked with a particular population. I've worked with all kinds. So personally I have, and being a foster parent before I was a therapist. So codependent no more. So when I was talking about codependency, here's one, okay? Here's one book on that. No More Mr. Nice Guy is a book about how to become codependent also, and getting what you want, which is boundary driven, okay? It's not the opposite, it's like, oh, I'm not going to be a nice guy anymore, so I'm going to be a jerk. It's just, it's a book about those kind of things. So Raising Emotionally Intelligent Child, one of my top 5 authors, Gottman's always in there. This is in my top 10 books. I have 2 parenting books, and I've read hundreds. But the thing is about parenting is for me, is very simple. How to raise an emotionally intelligent child and love and logics. So those are the most research-based, what makes a child definitely reliable in their own self in research, those two books produce the most reliable, what's my other word I'm thinking of? Responsible is the word I'm thinking of, child out of parenting. So attached is about having your adult attachment moving into a healthy, secure attachment as an adult. Okay. Dan Siegel, I mentioned many times, the whole brain child, mindful or mindsight, brainstorm. He teaches. So out of that a lot, he has a great website. So Dan Siegel. And running on empty, I talked about, and the emotional neglect, and then the body keeps a score I talked about. So I'm going to put this one. I realized I didn't have it. The becoming attached. I'm going to add to this list. So the body keeps the score just talks about trauma and how we hold it in the body. So trust, right? Here's attachment. Here's trust. So how do we move through so we can get to safety? So we can trust is the next step. So, okay, anything else for today? Any other chats and questions? Everybody find the YouTube channel. This will go on there after we get it transferred onto there. And any other subjects, you can always email me. And I'm just going to put my email in the chat at carol@blomquist.com, and you can always email me. And I'll end the recording, and if anyone wants to hang back and chat, we can chat. But thanks for joining, and you can jump out and get back to things if you need to. But I'm going to end the recording.